I want to start by telling you, if I can get my computer to work well enough, some things I like about the paper. That's always underemphasized and often goes by fast, but it's important to say. And then make a few minor points and then some more substantive ones. I like this paper in a lot of ways. I like that it's randomized and rigorous so that I actually believe the results. It's looking at something that I believe is pretty novel, looking at the impacts of contract design within microfinance, so I think that's good. It is questioning something that's often taken for granted in the microfinance world. Well, this is how you do things. The repayment starts immediately, and it helps us see things afresh and ask questions that we might not have asked enough. I like the case studies. I don't think you mentioned those, and they're brief in the paper, but I like that you went and did some qualitative work and actually talked to some borrowers. That really helped me think about the results and understand them better. I like that it's long-term, meaning in this case 3 years, which is long-term by the standards of the literature on the impacts of microcredit at this point. Most of what we have on the sort of the most flashy, the sexy studies about the impact of microcredit are only looking 18, 24 months at most. And so there's really a need to try to go longer term. And this, of course, doesn't directly get to that bottom line question of what is the impact of microcredit, but it's still very nice that it goes beyond the usual time frame. I think it's good that it has both theory and empirics. The reason, people argue about whether it's really useful to have a model and all this stuff, or is it just sort of useless abstraction? But I like it when papers have models, because then when I get to them, I can just skip right over them and feel like I've made a lot of progress. So I appreciate that. And I really like the positioning that you offered at the beginning of your talk. But this is sort of helping us understand this mystery. On the one hand, the microcredit impact studies are mostly returning zeros when it comes to overall impact on household welfare. Although it should be said that they're tending to find increases in profits and business starts to some extent. On the other hand, we have this other literature led by, I think, DeMel, McKenzie, and Woodruff, showing remarkably high marginal rates of return to capital for micro-entrepreneurs, 10% a month. So how do we square these two things? And you're helping us try to get at that, which I think is great. A couple of minor points. You have some outliers that you trim, and the text I think says that removing these 4 high outliers, I think they're high, doesn't really affect the results much. But when I looked at the tables, it seems like there was a pretty big impact in the coefficients. Whether it was statistically significant is another question. I think it was about 1 standard error. But it did raise in my mind, some questions about the sensitivity to the sensitivity tests. I think you used a cutoff of like the highest 0.5% of observations. And so I wondered, well, what if you do 1%? Why 0.5%? Is it going to have further impacts on the coefficients? This may be a distinct idea here, but I was also really impressed by the impacts on the variance of profits. Really big, much more variability in the treatment group. And so I wondered, could you tell us more? I guess I'm wondering there about outliers as well. You only tell us the variance, but could you do a histogram to show us the different distributions of profits in the 2 cases? And it would give us a fuller sense of what's going on with outliers and so on. Okay, did some more substantive points. The text refers to an individual liability contract. That is, the classic description of group microcredit is that a group of people, usually women, get together and they're all legally responsible for each other's loans, or at least responsible in some sense. One defaults, others have to pay. And that is distinguished within the microfinance world from individual microcredit, which is a one-on-one relationship. It may be the case that the contracts involved here, if there really were legal written contracts, were individual liability, but it really looks to me like this was essentially a group liability mechanism. And when I say essentially, I mean payments were done in public, so you had to think about the embarrassment that would result if you didn't pay on time, which is one aspect of joint group microcredit in practice. There may have been other mechanisms at work where the loan officer would not disperse new loans to these people until these people had repaid, even if there's no formal joint liability. So my strong presumption, until given evidence contrary to this would be that this is effectively a joint liability arrangement. It appears to me that the clientele here was a little bit richer, or I should say less poor, than that in the Hyderabad impact study. I think that the impact study that's gotten a lot of attention by JPAL had people that were around at $2 a day, and this is a little bit more like closer to $4 a day, I think, if you do it per capita, $3.50, something like that. Just seemed like that was worth noting. It's around the Indian average, I think. The impact of the treatment on income, as you mentioned, is like 10 to 18% higher income. So this is tantalizingly close to the first measurement of the long-term impact of microcredit. Again, if you define long-term as 3 years. But it isn't quite, because we're not comparing these people to people who didn't get offered microcredit at all. But it's so close that I wondered if you could try to milk it a little bit more. I mean, are we? So what we're told here is that we've got two groups offered different kinds of microcredit, and there's this big income difference between them after 3 years. So either they both improve their income substantially, there's just more for one group, or one went up and one went down, or both went down. Can we get any more insight into that? Maybe if we do differences in differences, can we make any judgments about which scenarios are more or less likely? Is it worth discussing? Because it seems potentially very interesting, even though I realize you can't reach a rigorous conclusion. But one thing I wondered, based on one of the case studies, there are two case studies. One looks at a woman who sells saris, I believe, and then the other is a woman who handed her loan over to her husband, who was a tailor, right? And he's the one of the two that ended up paying late, defaulting. And so just seeing that pattern made me wonder about the gender dimension to all this. Do you have information on how often the men actually controlled the loans? Does that variable relate in any way that you can measure rigorously with the outcomes? Are we seeing these higher profits and higher variability in profits more in households where the men are making the decisions? Because that's certainly the pattern in McKenzie et al.'s work. Is that they find that the returns to capital when the men are the entrepreneurs will be much higher. Sometimes it's like 10%. I think it's like 10% a month for the men and 0% for the women, something like this in one of the studies. So we know that there's a really strong gender component to this, and I don't know if you can get to that at all. Even though formally all the borrowers may be women, there can still be a gender dimension within the household, and that could be very interesting, I think. Maybe this is not a helpful point, but I wonder, can you think about the risk-return trade-off for the household? So you've shown that in the treatment group they have higher profits on average, but also more variable profits, which is a bad thing. How risk-averse do they have to be to not want this trade-off? It could be they'd have to be extraordinarily risk-averse that it's such a good deal. I don't know for sure. And in the same vein, there's this question of, is this a good deal for the MFI, or could it be? And you sort of go at this to the conclusion, but I feel like you could do more to really think about the implications for the microfinance institution. What was the cost of that? Can you put a number on that? How much did those delayed payments ultimately cost them? Do you have any information on whether loan officers had to spend more time chasing the defaulters, which has a financial cost, and that's what they're really afraid of having to do because it slows them down? If you have any information about whether their loan officers had to spend more time chasing these loans, that also hints at whether there are additional psychic costs for the borrowers in terms of the pressure that was brought to bear on them. But what is the overall cost-benefit ratio for I don't know if you say for society? Is there a case here for subsidy? Should donors come in and pay the cost of the higher defaults and allow the use of the contract that you piloted? Would that be a net benefit to society in some sense? It seems like you could answer those kinds of questions more than is currently being done. But this is my final point. What I think is really intriguing about this study is not just the headline result that there's this big effect, but the question of how it happens. And you talked a lot about this at the end, and I got it more out of your talk than the paper, which may mean I was just reading too fast. Entirely possible, because I was reading fast. What we're seeing is that a very modest additional amount of investment is leading to quite substantial impacts on income 3 years later. And so it seems like the the best way to explain that is that by having whatever it was, 3 or 4 payment cycles of grace period, they were able to make a little additional investment, like 6% more or something like that, just a little bit more. But because the rates of return to that capital were so high, 2 or 4 or 6% per month, over 3 years, that really compounded to a huge benefit, huge and ongoing benefit. So the question is, is this? It seems like there's a $500 bill, literally $500, because that's 10% of the typical household income here for a year. These 500 bills were on the sidewalk, just waiting to be picked up. Just a little bit higher investment, huge return long term. So the question is, why didn't people make those investments anyway? And there's sort of two competing perspectives. One is it was about scarcity of capital. They didn't have the capital. The other is that it's a behavioral thing, right? They couldn't discipline themselves. And I tend to think that it's a discipline thing. That if surely these people are not the poorest of the poor. They had the money. If they really wanted to, they could have made this investment anyway. And so on the one hand, that's helping me appreciate that microcredit really isn't, at least for this population, about relieving a scarcity of capital. It's about helping people solve behavioral discipline problems with new financial devices. And if that's what it's about, then it makes perfect sense that the precise design of the contract makes a big difference in whether it helps people summon the kind of discipline they need that is most useful. At the same time, you said that you actually don't believe one behavioral explanation. I'm thinking aloud here, so this may not all make sense. You said that the MFI thought that what was going on is that because people didn't have to start repaying right away, they didn't learn that discipline as well as those that did have to pay right away. And your data suggests that that's not in fact the case, that they were equally disciplined in repaying. So at least in that particular case, we're not seeing a behavioral story. If you know it, am I being clear? So I'm actually confused about whether this is supporting or refuting a behavioral perspective on what's going on here. At least, what is the full story? I'll stop there.